this is fairly similar to how we currently think the early modern playhouses may have been. And although we opened 17 years ago, the story for this project goes back much, much further. In some ways it goes right back to 1897, when an English actor called William Pole was becoming increasingly concerned about the way Shakespeare was being presented in West End theatres by people like Herbert Beerbohm Tree, whereby if they were doing one of Shakespeare's history plays, they would have a three-dimensional castle brought in from the wings and dropped in from above. They would have 200 people dressed as soldiers march around the stage, followed by people on real horseback. And it took them so long to do their scene changes, they cut most of the words from Shakespeare's plays. And the only thing interesting about Shakespeare are the words. And Pole got very frustrated by this, and he thought this is nothing like the way Shakespeare should be done. And he assembled a team of actors to dress as Elizabethans at Middle Temple Hall, and they performed Shakespeare with no scenery, in candlelight, in Elizabethan clothing. And it was the first time it had been done for centuries. But the idea didn't catch on. People were going, where are the horses? Where are the castles? We want the spectacle. But in America, about 30 years later, they did think it was a good idea. And during one of the World Fairs in Chicago, they built something a little bit like this as the English representation of Old England. And a teenage actor called Sam Wanamaker saw that building and thought it was a good idea. In 1949, he came to England for the first time, and he came here looking for the real Globe, and was rather surprised to find he had to drive around this area for 2 hours before he came across anything saying this is where Shakespeare had spent his adult life. Have any of you been to Stratford? Stratford-upon-Avon? Yeah. If you go, you would be forgiven for thinking Shakespeare had spent his entire life and career in Stratford. They will help you with that misconception. They will charge you money to get into any building with the weakest link to him. My favourite being Thomas Nash's house, the house belonging to Shakespeare's granddaughter's husband. It didn't exist in Shakespeare's lifetime. He never saw that building, and they charge you £9 to go and see it. The RSC is based there, Warwick University has a base there, all sorts of things relating to Shakespeare. And yet it is easy to argue that Shakespeare did nothing of any importance in Stratford. There were no theatres there at any time in his life. Plays were rarely performed there. They were performed, but not as often as they were in London. And at some time in Shakespeare's life, he chose to come here to make money as an actor and playwright and poet. And Sam knew that, and he thought it was shocking that this area was completely derelict. So he went to lots of English people and said, why don't you build a theatre like the Globe where it was? And they went, are you ridiculous? Are you stupid? Nobody wants that. And they were very worried that it would become a theme park with wenches selling ale and going, oh my lord, and all that kind of thing. And for 20 years, Sam met total resistance from the English. They just weren't interested in the idea. But he could see that there was a reason for doing it, and he wouldn't give up. And eventually his brother said, look, you build it, because they're not going to. So he then surrounded himself by people from all over the world. People with money, people with skills, academics who could tell him what they thought the Globe might have been like. And this is the result of the input of all of those people's experience and expertise. And it is now possibly one of the most popular venues for presenting Shakespeare in the country. And it's the nearest we'll get to the sort of space he wrote for. We think this is the right size and shape. We've certainly used the right materials. The bricks, they're handmade, especially for the project. The wood is oak, hand cut from living trees. And it will expand and contract and change shape the whole time, which is why it's held together by wooden pegs and not metal bolts. It's why we've used historically accurate plaster, which has goat hair mixed into it, and that enables the walls to move without breaking. If you don't put in some kind of fibre into the plaster, it'll crack and fall off within months. The roof, that's made of water reed, and there's no practical reason behind that except that it was cheap 400 years ago. Now, water reed is actually the most expensive type of thatch you can get, and it was very unusual 400 years ago in this area to use a material like that. In fact, technically it is illegal to use that in London, and it still is to this very day. London burnt to the ground in 1212, and King John banned thatch and exposed timber frames in the City of London. And to this day, that is still the case. Luckily, we are not in London. London is on the other side of the river. It is only 1 square mile, and the City of London has no authority here, and that is precisely why we're here on this side of the river, because in the city they didn't want actors. They're worried about public gathering, there's no space to build playhouses, and they don't like actors because they're predominantly Puritan in the city, and actors lie to earn their living. That is a sin. Actors are deeply sinful people, and the sinning that happens in these playhouses is a direct cause of the plague in England.
Oh, okay.
It's true. And well, actually, they're kind of right, in a way. You get one person in a building like this with the plague, it's going to spread very quickly. So they may have been wrong in their reasoning, but they're actually quite correct in a way. But on this side of the river, they did actually allow the people to have their place of entertainment, because they knew you have to let people release themselves every now and then. And we are now in one of the liberties of London, and to this day we are at liberty to do certain things you can't do elsewhere, and that includes using this roof. But we did have to get special permission from the fire safety team, and we've fitted a sprinkler system. It's mounted on fireboard, it's soaked in special chemicals. It's about as safe as we can make it. The one thing we've not been able to replicate well is the floor. Or rather, well, we did replicate it perfectly well, but it didn't work. It cracked and it broke and it made lots of dust. It was a mixture of lime, sand, silt, ash and hazelnut shells. And we copied that from a surviving piece of the Rose Playhouse floor. And from the original floor, it's quite obvious they spent all their time repairing it, but we didn't somehow think about that beforehand. So we went through all the expense of copying it and then gave up on it. But if you come and see a play this year, you're not likely to see the floor anyway, because this will be filled with people, and there will be up to 700 people standing here during the performance. They would have put up to 1,000 people there, so 700 is not as crowded as it might sound by any means. And you do have to stand up, you're not allowed to sit down at any point in time. So let's go and do that, let's go and stand.